Okay, everybody, so today we're going to work on the third example. Real quick, let's just review where we're at. We've made two graphics examples so far. The first one, seen right here, was just a basic extension of a J-frame. So we learned how we could take our classes, extend other classes to make more familiar looking type graphical user interface type programs. We also learned how you could add components. Okay. By the way, there is a odd name for these sometimes. Okay, for those of you who want to learn a little bit of weird trivia. These things are often just called components of a GUI, right? Labels and stuff like that. But there's another name that some people call them. They call them windows. And again, don't think of that as Microsoft Windows, but just Windows in general. Gadgets, which they shorten to widgets. So sometimes these are called widgets, okay? So in online documentation, you might encounter that word widget, and often it's used to express it just like Windows gadgets, which are just components you're placing inside of there. So anyways, that's just a piece of minor trivia there. And then in the second example, we also did the same thing. We added some widgets, and what we did in the second example that we're going to I'm going to try and go over a little more detail again in the third example, is the idea of adding what's called a listener, okay? An action listener. So it's listening for some sort of action to be performed. We added that listener to our button, and if an action occurred, we called our own method called add numbers. So it went down here to this method. But this is an important piece, right? This idea of listening for an event to occur, okay? In grade 10, the easy way to do that was to just sort of double click or right click the object that you were trying to put code associated with. I often called it things like trigger events, right? Like what triggers this code? In this case, just the clicking of the button, the action of this button is what triggered it, okay? Today we're going to go into that in a little more detail on some other types of actions to deal with there. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to go back to our main method. Just one sec, everybody. Okay, so what we want to do is go to the main method again, and we're going to make a Graphics3 this time. So we'll make a Graphics3 called Graphics3 equals new Graphics3. So we're going to make our third thing, and you can use the light bulb to build that method, or sorry, to build that class called Graphics3. Okay. So for this, just like our previous one, I'm going to suggest that we put the keyword public in front, and at the end put extends JFrame. Okay. So Graphics3 is also an extension of JFrame, and you'll need to import JFrame. And then we'll get started writing the Graphics3 constructor. So this is kind of the blank template now. Just like when you first started learning Java, you learned how you just make like public static void main, and that was the basic template for just making a basic Java program, and you worked your way through most of my units with that basic template. Now, this is kind of the basic template for making that, but within the framework of an actual GUI, graphical user interface type thing. Okay? So again, we're going to probably use a lot of the same code that we did in the previous two. Like back here, we're probably going to use these same sorts of things: set size, set visible, set resizable. So I'm actually going to steal those lines rather than retype them all. I'm just going to take them over to Graphics3 and paste them in. Okay? So there we go. So now Graphics3 has the same sort of general properties. But in terms of size, I want to make this one quite a bit larger. So not 500 by 500, but 1300 by 800. So it's going to be quite large. Okay? Visible true, resizable I'll make false. I don't need it to be resizable. And this one will be Graphics3. Okay? So at this point, you could do a quick run on it just to make sure that Graphics3 is actually displaying. And there it is. This nice large window, so you've got a large space to work with. And you could play with those numbers if you want. They could be, but you want a large space there for working this code. Okay. Now, this might actually be a good opportunity to start thinking about that the fact that we do these kind of same sets of lines all the time, although we might modify them, might also be something to start thinking about how you could optimize this code into things like methods or even things like classes. So here's something I want to do with this one. I want to turn these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code into a method. Okay? And I want to show you a way that NetBeans can kind of automate that. It's fairly easy, but basically, if you highlight code and you go up here to this menu called refactor, okay? Refactoring code is essentially automating, and there's something you can do up here to introduce a method. You'll see it down here, introduce method. So if you do that, if you go refactor, introduce method, it brings up a box and says, okay, will do. What kind of method do you want? Do you want it to be public, private, etc.? By default, it's going to make it private, which is fine. And I should basically give this method a name that represents what's going to happen here. So really, what I just did with those 5 lines of code is I kind of set the frame. So why don't I just call it set frame or something like that? And click OK. And you'll notice what it does is it automatically, for you, creates the method, pulls the code out, sticks the code in the method, and leaves the method call sitting where it was. So it's a really fast way when you start getting your code and you think, hey, this code could be thrown into a method. Sometimes you can use programs like NetBeans, and Eclipse does this too, to automatically kind of build the method for you. Just like it used the light bulb for that, that's a nice quick way to just quickly slap a method on there instead. And then as well, as a good programmer, now that you have this method done, setting up the frame, you can use like the interface to, for example, collapse that method by clicking on the minus sign, and it just sort of clears up your space there. So notice how I could theoretically just clear it up there. So just sort of a good coding practice to get into is that idea of just kind of keeping your code organized. Okay, so now let's go back to our constructor. So theoretically, we've set up our frame. It's all set up. We now have to think about, as well, the flow layout of our container, right? Now, in the past 2 programs, we made a thing at the top of our code called a container object, a kind of invisible thing to place things inside of. And we can do that again if we want to. But the reality is the way we use that thing, this container, is we get it from our JFrame, which makes it kind of, well, why would I have to do that? Why couldn't I just use the JFrame itself? And you actually can. So I'm going to show you how you do that right now. The thing is, it gets, the code's a little more complicated. So here's how it goes. You go this, because what I'm about to do, let me just stop for 1 second. So I'm about to take these 2 lines of code and turn them into 1 line of code without the container object. So here's how it would go. This dot get content pane dot set layout to be null. That's doing it all in 1 line. Because what it's doing is again, you can imagine, and now hopefully you have the sort of coding background that this makes a little more sense. This parameter is being sent to this method. That method is being called from the container, which is retrieved, is returned from this method. So this method returns a container. That method is being called by this. This is the JFrame, which is Graphics3. So here's what I mean by the vocabulary of this unit. Okay, this parameter, okay, is being sent to this method, which is being returned from that container from a method of this, which is a JFrame, which is a Graphics3, through inheritance. Okay, so here you can see some of the vocabulary of our past units coming into play, right? You'd need to know this from our methods unit, and this from our methods unit. You'd need to know this from our classes unit, this from our classes unit, method unit, method unit. So really the new stuff we're learning about containers and layouts is really the new graphics stuff. But it's not new in the sense that it's using stuff we already know about, like methods and stuff. So here's why I like to do graphics last, is now you have a much deeper understanding. Whereas in grade 10, I would say things to you guys like, well, just do that code. It's just going to work, right? Just do it. Don't question me. Just do the code. Now you should be questioning me as to exactly what the dynamics of each line of code you type mean. Okay. So now, let's create some properties for this class. Since it's going to be a painting program, I'll call it a Photoshop type program, we're going to need a couple things to make it look nice. So we'll make a private color object called background. So like any good drawing program, we need a background color, and we'll create a second one for the foreground color. Now color is an object that you'll have to import. It doesn't automatically import it. You'll have to click the light bulb to import up top here color. And now again, based on the learning in this unit, we've taken a little bit of time to look at the way these imports work. We've imported JFrame and we've imported color from two different libraries, AWT and Swing. Anyone remember what AWT stands for? Abstract Windows Kit. Correct. And then they both come from two different libraries, Java and JAVX, a core library and extension library, but who remembers the difference between those two libraries? Heavyweight, right. Which one's heavy? Someone other than Christians. Which one's heavy? Java or JAVX? Which one? Java, that's right. And what does heavyweight mean? It attempts to mimic the environment that it's in. And for color, that's important, right? Color kind of, there's actually what's called a different gamma between Mac monitors and PC monitors or Windows environments. And you know, different monitors can have different gammas. Mac, being the company that produces their own hardware and software, knows what's going into that, so they have a little more fine control over that. As well, these Mac hardware developers tend to really put a lot into that stuff because they know that those devices, the Macs, are used by people that color matters to. Like, for example, Macs are very prevalent in, say, the graphic arts and the sort of video production world, where color is a big deal, where you have these people that are really picky about that stuff. Whereas PCs are a little more multitaskable, right? And they're often done by people like programmers like us. I used to like to describe them as the Mac is like a fancy sort of sports car, and the PC is kind of like a Jeep. It's not necessarily pretty, but it can go anywhere and it can do anything, whereas the sports car gets stuck in the mud, right? That's kind of what, but it looks nice and it looks pretty, right? And people are impressed when you have one. That's kind of the way I describe it, but maybe that's not the best analogy. All right, I think I'm losing focus here. All right, so we've got these two colors. Since we're going to be drawing on this thing, we're going to need to keep track of our position. So we're also going to have a little private int, x and y, to store coordinates, like Cartesian geometry coordinates. Okay? We're also going to need to keep track of a count. So I'm going to make a count variable as well. I'll kind of get into y later. And as well, a little integer for size. And I'll get into y later. Okay? Well, I'll actually get into y right now. The size is for the size of the brush when we paint and draw on our program, right? You can have a little brush or a big brush, and size will store what particular value it holds. Count will be something like the click count when we double click or single click and stuff like that. So that's what that will be. Okay? It's fairly easy. We'll have one more. A string called choice. We're going to give the user different brushes to use in this program. So they'll choose one of the brushes, like a square brush or a round brush and stuff like that. So that'll be, we'll provide them with a menu where they can choose it from. And so the answer they give back will be a word, like the word round. So that'll be their choice. And again, we'll get into that later, but I'm just sort of creating the properties that we're going to need at this point. So these will be our needed properties. And as well, I might as well give the users all the choices of brushes right now in a private string array of strings called brushes. Why not? This array will also be a final array. We will not be changing it. This will just be the array of stuff that we will be giving the user. So that's why I'm typing it in all capital letters, because it's not going to be changing. It's just going to be something we're going to display. And we know what it is, so I'm going to use, these curly brackets, you may remember, is a way I can define the array right away. Okay? So here's the different types of brushes that we're going to give the user to use. Now I'm just going to move this down so it's easier for you guys to see. But we're going to give them the option for a filled oval. Okay? So that'll be one of the brushes, is a filled-in oval, essentially a circle. So one of the brushes that they'll be able to draw, and you think about this in programs like Photoshop, right? One of your brushes could just be a circle. It could be filled in with a color, and then the other option will be an open circle. We'll do the same thing with a rectangle, filled and open. So these will be some of the brushes that we'll be building up, so you can get the idea of the kind of stuff we'll be drawing with. So filled oval, open oval, we'll call it open, why not? Filled rectangle, open rectangle. And again, the reason why we're putting it into a string array is then later we don't have to worry about matching our spelling to it. We'll just use this global array to choose from. Okay? So there's 4 different types of brushes. We'll also have something called a 3D rectangle. That'll be one of our choices. We'll have what's called an arc. That'll be one of our brush choices, an arc. And then 2 more. A filled polygon. You guys know what a polygon is? What's a polygon? It's a shape. Yes. It's a shape. Your math teachers are doing a wonderful job with these kids. And then an open polygon. Wow. All right, so those will be our different types of brushes. And you don't have to put them all on separate lines like that. I just did that so it's easier for you guys to read what I coded in there. Okay? So we have this big array of all our brushes. And let me just count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different brushes. 8 different brushes to choose from. Okay, we actually could make more, but I think that's going to be plenty. Okay, so we kind of have set all this up. So now let's put some of that into our constructor now. Anyone miss any of that code? I'll back up a bit so you can see more at once. So in our constructor, we have to set a few of the properties. So for example, background, we will set to a specific color. Well, let's use a simple one. We can use color.white as our generic background color. Our generic foreground color will be color.black. That's generally the way these kind of programs work, is they start with a white background and a black brush. So we'll set it up that way as well. We're going to give the user the option to change that, but for now we'll just sort of set it up that it's going to be like that. Okay, also x will be equal to 0. Well, actually x and y will both be equal to 0, so we can kind of get fancy. We can say x equals y equals 0. That's kind of a fancy way to do it, right? Because we're setting both to 0 at once. You could have separate lines if you want. Size, we have to give it a default size. So let's keep it small to start and keep it at size 20. Now this is going to be measured in pixel size, so it's fairly small still. And our choice, we have to start with a default choice. Now if you wanted to, you could retype this, but that would be kind of a waste of your time, and there's a good possibility you might forget to capitalize the O right here, which is why the array comes in handy. Brushes, bracket 0, will be our default choice. The first brush will be our default choice. Okay, so here you can see the idea. We've got our properties. We've set our properties. And we've set them to default values, right? That's kind of you think about that, most programs when they start have default values set up, which is why I might encourage you again to highlight these lines and, is there a way to, I thought there used to be a way to, yes. If you don't want to go up to the menu, you can also do it this way, okay? You can actually just right-click on the code you just highlighted and then find the word refactor and then scroll down to introduce method again. That's another way you can do it, is just through right-clicking. Introduce the method. Let's just call it set defaults. And then boom, it's done, okay? So now again, you're methodizing your code. You're dividing the instructions into specific sections. So here I set up the frame, right? And then I set my defaults. And again, when you go to debug now, if this became your final project, which by the way, a ton of students have used this particular example and developed it more into final projects. And there's nothing wrong with doing that as well, especially for those of you who are kind of struggling for ideas. But now when you go to debug, you can kind of focus on the methods that are causing the problem, right? So it's like, why is it not got a white background? I thought I set that. Maybe I should look at my set defaults method to see why that's not working. Okay, so set defaults, set frame. Okay, so I'm just kind of trying to model that kind of coding to you guys that sort of shows that going on there. Okay, we could theoretically put this in its own method as well, but you don't want to go nuts here. I think we're going kind of nuts already. So the next thing we want to do is I'm just going to run a test on this. What you'll see is the white and the black are not applying. Well, the black won't apply because we don't have anything to draw yet. But I don't see a white background here. I don't know about you guys, but that didn't work. So although I've set the default colors, I didn't apply them to the frame. I didn't actually put them on the frame. So I could put that code right in my constructor, or I could add it to my set frame method, which I think I will do. I'm going to say this dot set background to be background. This dot set foreground to be foreground. So that's setting it for my frame, right? The background and the foreground are being set. I run it. Still not white, because there's actually a bit of a trick to this as well. Colors and the way they're applied also need to apply to the container. So we have to add two more lines. This dot get content pane dot set background to be background, and this dot get content pane dot set foreground to be foreground. Boy, it sure is handy if you know some of those Alt-Enter shortcuts now to automate some of that code. So that these two lines now, or sorry, these 4 lines of code can be so much faster for you to type if you can learn some of those tricks, including things like copy paste. And now we're getting the white background, which is what we wanted. Okay? We'll get to the black background in a minute, but that's a way to set the frame. So now after I've set the defaults, so now these have their default colors, I can apply them to my frame. Just like I'm applying the size and the visibility and all that, I'm applying those to my frame as well. Okay? And I did it within that method. So it's targeting the area that I'm kind of specifically changing. Okay. Anyone need a minute? Yeah, okay. Okay, so the next thing I want to say is we're now going to set up our listeners. We want to set up the events for this program that are going to listen to the things that are going to happen. Now, again, this is something you want to do in your constructor, is set up the listeners. So I could go through that process of writing all the code and then putting it into a method like I showed you before, but sometimes you can think of this ahead of time. Why don't we set our listeners right here? We'll make a little method to do that. So now when you take a look at what the constructor says, like when I construct a Graphics3, what do? Well, I do these things. I set the layout to null, I set the defaults for the program, I set up my listeners, and I set up the frame. And by the way, sometimes you could use the word set up instead of just set. But that kind of now makes sense as to what's going on there. So now I'll use the light bulb to just make a method called set listeners. Okay? So now I can go down to that method, set listeners, and start keying it in as to what it actually does. And again, from a design perspective, you can now kind of collapse those other methods to just make room as you've been coding, right? So here are the three things, or the other methods. But let's set up the listeners for this thing. Okay? Now, this was the part that we looked at yesterday, this idea of action listeners and stuff like that. And yesterday, in Graphics 2, we did that. We made an action listener called button listener, and then we took that button listener right here, and we added it to the button. Now we happen to not have any buttons in this program. What we're going to add to is the frame itself. We're going to add not a button, not an action listener, but something to deal with the mouse. We're going to use the mouse for this program. So we're going to add something called a mouse listener. However, we're also going to kind of jump ahead a little bit. We're not going to make a mouse listener and then add it. We're going to take all this code and also turn it into one line of code. But it's kind of assuming a lot there, but I think you guys are ready for this. So that was yesterday. Here's today. Okay? What we want to do is say this, which means the JFrame, dot add, and there are three types of mouse listener objects. There's this generic mouse listener, which listens to mouse events. Then there's the mouse motion listener. What that listens for is when the mouse is moving around. So the first one listens to clicks, right? So when you click the mouse, it picks up that. The second one listens to the actual movement. So that can be things like hovering effects and stuff like that. Or in our case, dragging. And then the third one is actually listening to the wheel on your mouse. So we are actually going to use all three one at a time. The first one we're going to use is the mouse motion listener. Okay? So this is going to listen for the movement of the mouse. And what we do is instead of the word null, we put new right there, mouse, motion, and here you want to use Control Spacebar. And there's two options, a mouse motion adapter and a mouse motion listener. But the one we're actually going to use is the one you wouldn't have thought of. It's actually the one called the mouse motion adapter. Okay, that's the one we're going to be using. But if you actually look down here in the documentation, you can actually get a clue as to why. It says that the mouse motion adapter actually is an extension, which you know now what that means, of the mouse motion listener. Which means it is a mouse motion listener. But it's a mouse motion listener plus stuff, which is good. We want more stuff. Everybody wants more stuff. Now, when you hit enter, it's going to fill in a bunch of code for you. I'm going to warn you right now. So mouse motion adapter, boom, and then, oh, you got to do it twice, and then boom again, and it didn't. Didn't fill it in. All right, so we got a little bit more work to do. I thought it would do this for us, but it didn't. So this is what we have so far. We have add a mouse motion listener, which is a new mouse motion adapter. and we're going to write our own method inside here. We're going to write our own little method right in here. Just one sec. Did it put a... Oh, it didn't. Oh, there it is. I knew it would have to have a little... Thought that was weird. So hang on. We've got to format this code a little bit. It came out, at least it did for me anyways, a little bit weird. Okay, so here's the way it should have come out. It should say mouse motion adapter with an opening bracket there. There should be a blank line, and then there should be the closing curly bracket, the closing round bracket, and the semicolon. In between, we're going to write this. Public void, okay, mouse, lowercase, dragged, uppercase D, okay, mouse dragged, bracket, mouse event, event. And you have to get the spelling right here because we're actually not using our code. We're using other code. Okay, I thought it would fill it in for us, but it didn't. So we have to fill it in properly ourselves. We are using somebody else's method and we are overriding it. Okay? With the mouse event, you will require an import for that. Okay? And then it will say something like override, which you can put in if you want. This just says that you are overriding somebody else's method, which is what we wanted to do. So it's actually right in the spot where my cursor is right now, where we would actually put the code that we'd want to actually have happen. But we're not. We're going to call a method. But again, this was something we did yesterday, so it's really kind of confusing code the first time you see what's happening here with these listeners. But this is all one line of code, believe it or not. This is all one line of code. But it's sort of right here where the parameter starts of our method. And the parameter of the method ends right here. So if we just eliminate anything between these two red brackets, really all we're doing is we're saying this JFrame is adding a mouse listener to the JFrame. And what is it adding? Well, it's adding this parameter, whatever that parameter is. Okay? So if we just think of it that way, that we're saying the JFrame, this, dot adding this thing for a mouse, and then whatever we're adding right there, that would be a very easy line of code, right? It would just say add some sort of mouse listener, and that's X. And yesterday we did that by first making the mouse listener and then putting it in there. So instead of what we did yesterday, what instead we're doing is we're saying in between these square brackets right here, this is what we're adding. So it's a weird sort of syntax to it. But that's the parameter right there. What that is it's us making a class temporarily. We're actually building a whole class right there. So this thing is actually a class, okay? But it's a class that already exists called the mouse motion adapter. So we're not defining the class. We're creating an object. So it's not the class. We're creating an object of that class. We're instantiating it. But here's a really tough question. I'll actually let the grade 12s answer this one if they can get it. What's the name of this instance? That's right. It doesn't have one. It is a nameless instance, which actually is called an anonymous class. This is an anonymous, actually not an anonymous class, an anonymous object. It's like, when babies are born, they call them like baby, John Doe, because it doesn't have a name yet. This is anonymous. This is an anonymous object within the mouse listener. It's crazy, but that's what's happening. Then, while we're building this object, we override a method within the mouse adapter class called mouse dragged. And we say, okay, I don't care what you say mouse dragged is supposed to do. I'm going to tell you right here what mouse dragged is supposed to do. It's kind of tricky. It's actually one of the big criticisms of learning Java is how kind of obtuse that is to actually learn how to just do something as simple as just moving a mouse around. But it is kind of a deep piece. But for a lot of you, you may just want to mimic my code and then kind of try to grasp some of the concepts going on here. So anyways, we're finally there. What should we do when we drag the mouse? Well, let's just call our own method that we'll write later called mouse moving, and we'll pass it event. We'll pass it to that. So that will be a method that we're going to write called mouse moving. So let's go down and just write that real quick below the method that we're in right now. So I know we're in a set listeners method. So let's write this little private void mouse moving with a mouse event that we'll just call event right there. Okay? And that will eliminate the error up there. And we'll get to that later. We'll get to this later. We'll do this method later. That, by the way, is called a stub. It's a method that is placed there temporarily to make this guy happy, and we'll get to the logic of that later. But right now we're going to work on the logic up here still. We got to add a couple more listeners to this program. This program is only listening for mouse motion right now. Let's add a few more features to this program. Okay. So now we've added a mouse motion listener, and I went through it slowly so that you kind of grasp what was going on. Now we're going to do the next one called the mouse wheel listener. So we go this, and actually I'll leave a line just so you can see. This dot add mouse wheel or wheel listener. So we get to there, just like we did before. So now we're at the parameter stage. What should the parameter be? Well, the parameter will be a new mouse wheel listener. This only gives you one option, the mouse wheel listener. And when you use autocomplete twice, it should this time fill in a bunch of code for you. Perfect. This time it did fill in the code for us. The mouse wheel listener. And notice how this is very similar to the one above. It's the same kind of structure, creates an anonymous class, it overrides a method. There's a slight difference here in the sense that this used a parameter called a mouse event, and this one uses something called a mouse wheel event. Okay? But other than that, it's pretty much similar. It did a lot of auto importing for you, by the way, to do this. Okay? A lot of the imports for this kind of code is being done for you by NetBeans. So if you actually go up to your import section up top, you'll notice a ton of imports are now happen, right? Not just color, but mouse event, motion adapter, wheel event, wheel listener, and JFrame. And again, the more graphics you use, the larger that import section is going to get. Okay, so back to where we were. So now we'll write our own little method for this. We'll call it mouse wheel. And we'll pass it event as well. Okay? So let's write that thing. So under this, we'll say private void. And you can even steal your stuff from up here. And this is a mouse wheel event called event. And we're done. Whoops. There we go. Oh, pardon me. This should be E right here because it named it E right there. E for event. That's my apologies. Okay, so and you can name it E down here as well. So here I'm saying pass E to here in this method called mouse wheel, which I've defined here. Okay. So this thing is being called by the listener. And if you want, again, some programmers like to put all their code right there. It's just you're in so many levels of indent going on here. You're kind of leaving yourself open to a lot of possible errors happening. It depends how much logic you actually want to put into that method. If it's like one line, then I get that. That could be easily taken care of. But if it's a piece of logic that you're coding, then I might suggest you don't do that. Okay. Told you we were to buckle up today. It was going to be a big ride. So we've got now two stubs down here. What will happen when the mouse wheel is turned, and what will happen when the mouse moves around on our JFrame? We have one more listener to write. This is just the mouse clicking one, but I'm going to warn you, when it fills in the code, it's going to be a lot of code. So I'm warning you now, this is what's going to happen. So hang on. Buckle up, kids. Here we go. So we've added 2 listeners. And by the way, the nice thing about NetBeans as well, you can actually collapse these listeners. There's a little plus minus beside each listener thing, and you can actually collapse those if you want to shorten up your code. See how nice that is? It's very nice. Thank you, NetBeans. But anyways, here we go. This dot add mouse listener. Okay, so we get to this stage right here. Now before I type it, what am I going to type? New. That's right. New what? New mouse listener. That's right. But just if everyone could just watch me for 1 sec, watch how much code gets filled in. New mouse listener. There it is. And I hit enter. And then I hit enter again. It just added all that. Okay, so it adds all this code right here, right there. Because with a mouse listener, it requires you to override all these methods. It makes you override them. Now you don't have to actually put any code in there, but you have to at least have these overrided methods there. And they all perform different functions. This is when you click the mouse. This is when you press the mouse, which means it's just when the mouse button is being pressed down. This is when the mouse button is being lifted up. Clicked is kind of both of those together, down and up. Entered is when the mouse just enters into that area and then exits out of that area. These two will be good for things like hover effects, when the mouse is hovering over something. So it's crazy, all this stuff. Here's the way I would recommend you format this code once you get to here, is you actually don't need a bunch of this stuff, including that @override. That's nothing you actually need. So I'm going to delete a bunch of those @overrides. Okay. I'm going to also move that bracket up like that to the same line with a little bit of formatting like this. This is now, I hope, easier for you guys to digest, something like this. Because a lot of these can be basically just left blank. We only actually need to deal with one of them. So I'm just going to put that, pardon me, up like that for now. So that's what the mouse listener is listening for. The only one we actually need it to work on is the clicked one up here. And we'll make a little method called mouse click. And we'll pass it E, the event. And that's the method we'll write down here. We'll write private void mouse click mouse event. Okay, we'll leave that as a stub method. Okay, actually I'll actually move that one to its own line so it looks a little more professional like that. There we go. Okay, so here's what I need then. I need this thing added here, this mouse listener listening to mouse events, listening to click events. Most of these override methods you can just leave as empty. You can't delete them. You can't do that. It won't let you. If you remove that @override, it'll warn you, hey, should I put an @override in there? Which you can if you want, but I'm saving space. And then right here, I'm going to say that's where I'm going to call my method called mouse click down here. And this is where we're going to stop today. So on Monday, we'll fill in the pieces to this. But this was a lot to absorb today.